Hello and welcome to the Land and Climate podcast. My name is Bertie Harrison-Braninsky, and today I'm discussing ocean-based carbon dioxide removal with Professor David Ho, an oceanographer from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and a lead author on the upcoming United Nations IPCC report on carbon dioxide removal and carbon capture and storage.
You get into this dilemma of, okay, you've been warned that this thing is going to be terrible. Do we try it anyway just to prove it? Or do you say, okay, maybe we shouldn't do it? I think we're not really ready to have a methodology for marine carbon dioxide removal. We need a lot more research. But nevertheless, it's a political decision to include one of these techniques. So we're basically forced to do it.
I began by asking David to introduce himself and his work on carbon dioxide removal.
I've spent my career looking at the air-sea fluxes of CO2 and looking at factors that control that and looking at the fluxes in different environments, open ocean and coastal ocean, including blue carbon ecosystems, which include mangrove ecosystems. And recently, I've gotten into looking at marine carbon dioxide removal, which is one of these techniques that people have proposed to remove the excess carbon from the atmosphere.
I saw in some of your more recent journal articles, you'd said there has been a bit of a surge in investment and interest in marine CDR in recent years. Is that something you feel when you go to events at the moment? Is there a bit of a momentum building?
I feel like that was the case a few years ago, and now things are slowing down a bit. I think initially there was enthusiasm from the private sector, at least. And, mostly, unless you're talking about philanthropy, the private sector is interested in making money. And I don't think this is something that you make money from in the short term, because we've got a long ways to go before we develop it.
Yeah, that was partly why I was asking in a way, because it appears to me that there has been a bit of a decline in momentum building around other land-based carbon dioxide removal in the past couple of years. Now, I wondered whether some of that interest might have moved to ocean-based methods or if it's all wrapped up in the same trends.
Yeah, I think it's across the board. I mean, there's shifts between different techniques. People get excited about one thing and then they realize, oh, that doesn't work, or that takes too much energy or water or land, and then they look at something else. But I think across the board, there is a slowing down.
I also get the impression that we just know less about oceans than we do about some of the physics with CO2 and other greenhouse gases on land, and perhaps that is a broader knowledge gap with ocean-related topics. Is that true?
Yeah. One takeaway I got from this meeting in Milan and some others is that it's a detriment to people working on this and maybe the whole landscape that we lump everything together like there's one technique. In terms of the ocean, it's many different techniques that people have proposed. They all seek to reduce the level of CO2 in the surface ocean. And there are different ways to do it. There are ways that try to exploit photosynthesis, so drive up productivity in order to lower the CO2. But then there are geochemical techniques that just tries to shift CO2 into a different form of inorganic carbon. So you don't change the total amount of carbon, but you change the form of it so that it could take up more potentially. And so they have that in common. All the techniques seek to lower surface ocean PCO2 or partial pressure CO2. But the different techniques have different uncertainties. There are different things that we don't know about them. And it's true that with all the techniques, there are things that we still need to research. But some techniques, there are so many uncertainties. We already know that there's so many known unknowns. Of course, there are unknown unknowns, but just starting out, it seems really daunting to try to develop these techniques. But I wouldn't say any of them ready.
Could you maybe elaborate on that a bit and talk us through what are the common suite of options that we think about when we talk about marine CDR?
Yeah, maybe I'll focus on two of them. One biotic, using biology, and the other abiotic. So the biotic one involves putting iron in the ocean to stimulate productivity. And that works because iron is a nutrient that phytoplankton need. And there are areas of the ocean where you have plenty of nitrogen and phosphorus, but not enough iron. There's what people perceive as excess nutrients in these areas. Oceanographers have done these experiments going out in the ocean, putting iron into the surface ocean and seeing a bloom. People see this and they think, oh, this might be a way to stimulate uptake of CO2. The complication there is basically if you make something in the ocean, something's going to want to eat it. You have this excess production, but then it quickly gets consumed in the surface ocean. So it just gets recycled. And the organic matter that's created doesn't get to the deep sea.
And this organic matter, is that phytoplankton?
Yeah, it's the dead bodies of phytoplankton. And so that organic matter quickly gets turned back into CO2. So it doesn't actually do anything to change atmospheric CO2. And then you have an example of a abiotic technique that involves somehow increasing the alkalinity of the ocean. And alkalinity is this sort of complicated concept that even biogeochemists have a hard time with. And you can just think of it as magic, right? So you put some alkalinity in the water, and what it does is it shifts the CO2 into the other two forms of inorganic carbon in the ocean, which is bicarbonates. Sodium bicarbonate is baking soda. And most of the carbon in the ocean is bicarbonate. It's like 90%. It's dissolved. And then 10% is carbonates, like chalk, like calcium carbonate. And then very little, like less than 1%, is CO2. But CO2 is what exchanges with the atmosphere, so it's really important. But if you increase the alkalinity, it shifts more of that CO2 into carbonate and bicarbonate, which theoretically should allow the ocean to take up more.
And is that kind of a longer lasting sequestration?
It should be. People think that this should last tens to hundreds of thousands of years. One reason people have faith in this or have hope for this technique is because on very long time scales, like millions of years, this is how the Earth regulates climate. So if you have more CO2 in the atmosphere, then you speed up the hydrologic cycle. So there's more evaporation from the ocean and more rainfall on land. And that tends to weather the rocks on land. So you wash out lots of minerals, and some of them increase the alkalinity of the ocean. So these things get washed into the ocean, and that increases alkalinity, which allows the ocean to take up CO2. So it's like a thermostat that operates on Earth on millions of year timescales.
In practice, at scale, would that be huge amounts of ground up rock?
Yeah, potentially. So that's one of the proposed methods, is grinding up rocks so that they basically weather faster. But it's quite daunting to think that this might work.
And am I right in saying at the moment, the only technique that could be described as marine-based carbon dioxide removal that's deployed today is basically ecosystem restoration or growing mangroves?
Yes, some people do include blue carbon in CDR, and CDR being carbon dioxide removal. It's difficult to know whether those ecosystems are doing anything additional because it's really hard to check what these ecosystems are actually doing. But people like ecosystem restoration because there are other co-benefits. And in fact, there are a lot of people that think we should look at the carbon removal as the co-benefit and the ecosystem restoration for their own purpose.
So, for example, the two categories of method that you talked about a minute ago, is it that we are ready in theory to do it in terms of the practicalities of being able to do them, but more that we don't know what the impacts are or we wouldn't know how to measure the impacts? What's the scale of the logistical challenge in being able to do enhanced rock weathering or the biotic CDR forms that you talked about?
I think there are lots of reasons why we're not ready to do it. Without knowing whether it's effective or whether it has negative environmental impacts, why don't we just do it? The reason is that it's very expensive. And who's going to spend money on something whose efficacy is unknown? If you're really talking about doing it at scale, it's trillions of dollars. Who's got that kind of money to waste?
That is helpful to know, because part of why I asked that was we've done a couple of podcasts recently about geoengineering, not in the context of carbon removal, but like stratospheric aerosol injection. And one of the conversations that arises from some of those technologies is that it could be quite affordable to do it, or even certain incredibly rich individuals on the planet could potentially do some of these things themselves. We don't fully know what the side effects or negative consequences of some of those could be, but that doesn't sound like it's a similar context here.
I haven't heard those conversations, but the thing about any of these techniques is that once you start doing them, you have to keep doing them. Otherwise, when you stop doing them, the end result is worse than if you hadn't done anything. So I think it ends up being very expensive if you decide to do something.
So you authored this article for Nature a few years ago that got a huge amount of attention. It said on your Wikipedia that it's the most read, or one of the most read ever, pieces of writing on carbon dioxide removal, where you were warning about over-reliance on this, or the potential for CDR to defer action.
Yeah, but it's also to give people a sense of scale and how ineffective carbon dioxide removal is currently. Because in news stories, you often see journalists hyping something, magic rock dust. And people who don't pay attention think, okay, we've got the problem solved, and maybe we don't have to decarbonize. And that's really far from the truth. I think online, the title of the article is something like carbon dioxide removal is not a current climate solution. We have to change the narrative. And it's something that we're researching and potentially will have in the future. I'm talking about many decades from now, but it's not a solution we have now, and we might never have it. So it's really important that we implement the solutions that we do have today. If we just build out solar and wind, we're already doing a lot.
What was the academic response to that piece, and perhaps other communications or writing that you've made to that argument?
I've gotten really positive responses. I'm sure some people were quite angry about it, but mainly people were trying to sell carbon dioxide removal as a solution today. And there are certainly startups that have to do that in order to survive. But I think that points to that model where you have startups that are funded by venture capital as not a good way to develop potentially an important climate solution, right? I think that this kind of stuff really should be government funded and government led. I've said in the past that it should be like the Manhattan Project without the bomb. If we're serious about it, all governments should go in on this and they can try different things. Then a lot of the problems that exist for the voluntary carbon market wouldn't exist for that, because then you can try different things. You can afford to fail. And it's not just about developing intellectual property that you can then sell, because that's, I think, the only exit for these startups right now, because we are so far from deploying these things. It's not like the startups that exist today are going to be the ones that are going to be removing carbon at scale 50 years from now. If you look at, I think, the most successful carbon removal company is Carbon Engineering, this direct air capture company. And they're successful because they managed to sell themselves to a fossil fuel company for $1.1 billion. And I would bet that every single startup out there wants to be the next Carbon Engineering. I think it's not a good way to scale CDR if that's what we want to do.
I know that the US under the current administration has probably reduced funding for anything related to climate change, really. But are you seeing that trend start to happen in other countries with public funding towards the right kind of R&D in this space?
There's never been a lot of funding in other countries on the scale of the Biden administration in the US, where the Department of Energy put billions of dollars into both purchases and also setting up these direct air capture hubs. It hasn't happened yet. in other countries. But I'm hoping if we're serious about this, that's what happens, is that governments decide we have to do the research.
Is marine CDR dependent on startups then at the moment, or is there any kind of flagship public project?
I wouldn't say there are any flagship public projects. There are academic projects, but mostly the deployment of things in the ocean are done by startups, and then the academics are there to measure what happens. So they're not the ones that are trying to put things in the ocean. There's an exception, and there's a project done by the Woodside Oceanographic Institution, led by them, where they put some alkalinity in the water and try to see what happens. But that's quite rare. It's usually startups that do that, and then academics are partnering them somehow.
There's a line I've written down from one of the articles I was reading this morning. Long-term changes may only emerge gradually, raising the question of whether research will ever be able to fully capture such delayed effects. When the authors on the paper, including you, are discussing the potential negative or knock-on effects of different technologies. And that just made me wonder about this issue of scale. And obviously testing things at huge scale is very different to small pilots. And is there a barrier here where you'll never really be able to fully understand the implications of a large-scale deployment of one of these technologies until you do it? Is that basically what is being said there?
Yeah. So one thing I should say is, before I had broken down these techniques into biotic and abiotic. And biotic techniques will necessarily have an impact on ecosystems because you're manipulating the ecosystem. So we think those techniques have the potential to be more disruptive. The abiotic techniques, there could be some local effects because when you change the alkalinity, you increase what's called the saturation state of calcium carbonate. So it makes it easier for organisms that form shells out of calcium carbonate to do that. And that could preferentially help them outcompete other organisms. But that effect quickly gets diluted out in the open ocean. So we think for the biotic techniques, there could be a lot of impacts. You have excess nitrogen and phosphorus in some areas of the ocean. But the thing about the ocean is that the water moves, so that excess nutrient often is transported to other regions of the ocean where it's used by organisms. What happens is if you take away the nutrients, it's called nutrient robbing, right? You take away the nutrient from these other areas, then you don't get productivity. And you don't have productivity, you don't have the higher trophic level stuff like fish that people depend on for their livelihoods. So that effect can only be seen if you do the experiments at very, very large scales, which we will never do. So you then have to rely on models, and models have shown this effect. But then the people that really want to do it say, wow, that's just a model, we don't know for sure. So you get into this dilemma of, okay, you've been warned that this thing is going to be terrible. Do we try it anyway just to prove it? Or do you say, okay, maybe we shouldn't do it? And there are other potentially negative effects, like you could decrease the oxygen levels in the ocean because when you have respiration, basically, when you have things eating the organic matters that you've produced, then you consume oxygen and you release CO2 at that level. And if it's deep down at some mid-level of the ocean, so you can deplete oxygen there, and that would be bad for organisms that have gills.
I mean, to a layman, that all sounds pretty bad. Yeah. But how strong are feelings? Is it a big academic community in marine CDR or a small one? Are there quite emotional cliques about whether you should do some things, whether you shouldn't? I know that has been addressed in some of the papers I've glanced over, that there are people that urge deployment quickly and those that push back against ever doing certain things, and then people in the middle that want longer to research.
Yeah, so there are certainly people that want to do the research. And then there are mostly deep sea biologists that don't want anything done because a lot of these techniques might have detrimental impacts on deep sea ecosystems, which we don't know a lot about. So they've been very vocal about at least some of the techniques not attempted. And then there are scientists that just think that the scale is so overwhelming that it will never do anything. So what's the point in even looking at it? So like any subject involving the ocean, there are different voices that have different takes on things.
Would you say one of those viewpoints is perhaps dominant within the more influential institutions and organizations? Is there a trend towards one of those opinions or approaches?
I don't think so. As long as it's still just research, scientists are not usually against research. But then if you're talking about deployment, I think a lot of people would say we're not ready to deploy.
You've fairly recently been selected as the lead author for the UN IPCC's next report on carbon dioxide removal and carbon capture. Yeah, and congratulations on that, by the way. And did these kinds of issues come up at the first meeting in April?
No, that's a methodology report. So it's written so that there's this very esoteric thing where countries have these inventory compilers who basically determine how much greenhouse gases each country is emitting. And it's to give them a method to calculate the negative emissions, I guess the removal part of that equation. So we're there to do a job.
Like a guidebook for carbon accounting.
Yeah.
As technologies.
Yeah. So not a debate about whether these things should be done but implicit in writing the methodology is how effective they are. So that goes into the equations or the formulas.
And presumably like the reliability or accuracy of that carbon accounting does depend as well.
Yeah. So the uncertainty is in there as well. Yeah.
Generally with marine CDR, are you looking at more uncertainty with carbon accounting than you would with other forms of carbon dioxide removal?
I think we're not really ready to have a methodology for marine carbon dioxide removal. We need a lot more research. But nevertheless, it's a political decision to include one of these techniques. So we're basically forced to do it.
Which one of the techniques is that?
It has a very long name, but basically it involves stripping out CO2 from seawater at an existing facility that's already processing seawater and then putting that water back into the ocean. That method is usually called direct ocean removal. It's a strange method because when you're stripping the carbon out of the water, you first have to acidify the water. So that's the reverse of adding alkalinity. So you turn bicarbonate and carbonate into CO2, and then you strip it out. And so what you're doing is you're taking this permanently sequestered pool of carbon and mobilizing it. And so if you don't make sure that the CO2 that you strip out of seawater is buried somewhere for 100,000 years, then you've made the problem worse. And who's going to check that you've secured this carbon for 100,000 years?
Another shoot to bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, I guess. Perhaps less permanent with bioenergy. But
yeah, the thing about BECCS is that the wood that you're burning, organic matter you're burning, doesn't have such a long lifetime, whereas inorganic carbon in the ocean has a very, very long lifetime.
If you compared it to direct air capture, how would that form of CDR compare with cost and efficiency and energy consumption? Because these kinds of metrics are often raised as at least difficulties with direct air capture.
I don't know the comparison between direct air capture and direct ocean removal, but I know that both of them require a lot of energy. Say which one requires more.
But broadly, roughly same kind of ballparks. I get the impression maybe you're leaning towards enhanced weathering as being perhaps the more viable, these options. Or are you just broadly skeptical about all of this being something we should really be chasing to?
The more I research it, the more skeptical I am that at least we'll be able to do a lot of it. Not just technological or geophysical or even environmental reasons, but also the social acceptance part and the governance and the finance. It's just going to be very expensive, and who's going to want to do this, even if we could? But it's not clear if we could.
Were you more optimistic when you began looking at CDR?
I think maybe because I knew less about it, and maybe I wasn't thinking as much about these other areas. I was just thinking about the geophysical part. once you manage to do this in the ocean, then how does the ocean behave? But there are all these other factors that make it hard.
Do you think that kind of journey that you've just described is true of academic research on CDR more broadly? Do you think there is a kind of increasing skepticism?
I think I'm not unique in thinking that, but there are others that are still all in.
I guess the other broader point that we've not really covered so far is governance, something that does come up quite often in your pieces, but also writing about CDR is regulation and multilateral agreements. And what gaps are there for specifically ocean CDR right now in terms of law?
So I don't work on this, but I have read some stuff on it. So the London Convention, London Protocol specifically prohibits putting iron in the ocean for CDR, but it doesn't prohibit research. Then the question is, when does research become deployment? And it also doesn't say anything about these other substances that people have proposed to increase alkalinity. But there are local environmental laws that might govern these things. Right? In the US, there are state laws and then there are federal laws, and I'm sure in other countries as well. That needs to be worked out by countries either themselves or in the international context. But there is another question, which is that if we deploy marine carbon dioxide removal, it'll be done from the coast because that's where your energy supply is, that's where people are that can work on this, and then that's where your infrastructure is. So you'll do it within your own EEZ, you'll do the deployment. But all these marine CDR techniques rely on the ocean, the new ocean state that you create, equilibrating with the atmosphere. That happens over a large spatial scale. So it's either in someone else's EEZ or in the open ocean. So the question then is, who should get credit for the carbon that's removed? Is it the country that deployed it? Or is it where the equilibration happened? Or there's a third place, which is eventually this carbon is stored in the ocean, but it could be in yet a third place. And I don't think this is just an academic question because it matters that the re-equilibration happen, whether in your EEZ or in someone else's EEZ, because if it happened in someone else's EEZ, then it decreases their capacity to use the same technique to remove carbon. If MCDR is included in these NDCs, these nationally determined contributions, where countries do their inventory of removals, then it becomes really important. And that hasn't been worked out. And it's kind of a tricky thing.
It sounds like we're a way away from significantly scaled any CDR along coastlines anyway. So,
or any form of CDR, I think we're many decades from scaling.
At least, I guess, it doesn't sound like there's kind of any urgent threat other than, I suppose, deferred action in other areas. Is that right?
I think that's the biggest one to me. Like, I'm not worried about somebody deploying CDR or even solar radiation modification. I think mitigation deterrence is a real thing. We get too complacent with, oh, technology will solve whatever problem we have. And then we overlook the technology that can actually solve these problems, right? Whether it's renewable energy or transit or better bike infrastructure and things like that, like things that have proven to work and make people's lives better.
What do you think needs to change to kind of shift that emphasis away from these so-called unicorn technologies or magic solutions that policymakers can look towards to neglect other actions? We have had some people on the podcast before talk about issues with certain types of scientific modeling that have perhaps presented these pathways more as suggestions than scenarios, haven't always prioritized the right factors within the models. Do you think there is a kind of need for any of the leading scientific output to change around this, or do you see it more as a political issue?
It's a good question. It could be a cultural issue as well. If we normalize this in the things that we see in movies or television or in books, insofar as people still read books, I'm talking about normalizing the technologies that do work, renewable energy or electric vehicles, even though I wish we didn't have so many cars. When you watch movies, it's not often that somebody commutes by bicycle. And if they do, they're a loser, right? Like maybe Steve Carell in 40-Year-Old Virgin, right? He went around by bike. And if we just normalize that kind of behavior where it's perfectly normal for a mom to take their kids to their football games by a cargo bike or something, perhaps that will change how people look at these existing technologies that can actually make things better.
My thanks to David Ho for coming on the show, and to Vasco Kostovsky for our audio engineering. As always, we'll attach further reading in the episode blurb, and you can find much more to read on our site at landclimate.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please do follow us and leave a review. We really appreciate it, and then we'll see you again in 2 weeks' time for our next episode. Until then, goodbye, and thanks for listening.